great to be here for a lot of different reasons, not just because this is such an august and diligent group coming here at this hour of the morning, but also because being here means that I'm going to get out of a faculty meeting that begins shortly, at which we don't practice any of the things that I am going to talk about. So, sort of an example of what not to do. But let me tell you a little bit about what I want to do today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature and the meaning of strategic change, because that's what brought you here today, but it means different things to different people. So I want to be specific about what we're going to be talking about. Then I'll talk a little bit about various kinds of barriers to strategic change, but in particular I'm going to focus on the psychological barriers to strategic change, which I think are the most vexing and some of the most important. I'll give some examples of these barriers in action in real organizations, although their names will be disguised. And then I'll introduce two very simple concepts for understanding these barriers, and then I'll provide a little bit of advice for overcoming these barriers, but again, there are limitations to that advice, and I'll talk about that at that point. And then I want to leave time for questions and answers. You may have experiences with some of these barriers that we can talk about. This work is based on research that I actually did a number of years ago with Chris Argyris, who's a professor at Harvard Business School. He's now emeritus, but is one of the giants in the field of organizational learning and change. So the problem of strategic change is essentially one of the most critical and yet one of the most difficult forms of a purposeful organizational adaptation. It's critical because it's connected to the long-term survival and competitiveness of an organization. It's difficult because of the complexity of the economic issues involved, strategy and dynamic environments, and the psychological and organizational barriers that have to be overcome. This was a particularly hot topic in the 70s and 80s. People focused on the decline of organizations such as IBM, Sears, industries such as steel and auto, and many people came to the conclusion the failure was these organizations and industries did not change their strategies in a timely enough or effective enough way. So we're talking about strategic change. I want to be clear about what strategy is and why strategy matters. Strategy matters. We care about strategy because it's fundamentally concerned with the success and failure of firms or organizations. And this is just as true for nonprofit organizations. I see some of the folks who have been in our nonprofit programs. Public sector organizations, we're working now with public school systems in a joint program with the School of Education, as it does apply to businesses. And that performance at the most basic level is survival, whether they live or die. For for-profit firms, it's profitability. For nonprofit firms, it's an analog, which I like to think of as prosperity. And more basically, it's about performance, however that's defined by the organization. And strategy is the domain of knowledge that's concerned with trying to understand, predict, and control performance, and it begins with a desire to outperform the market. There's a lot of kind of misinformation out there about strategy. I think despite the best efforts of those of us who teach strategy and management in business school. So I want to say a little something about what is not strategy. Formal planning documents, the big thick binder that sits on the CEO's desk that says strategy, that's not the strategy. It may be consistent with the strategy, but in and of itself, that binder that says strategic plan is not the strategy. It's the intended strategy, and whether it's realized depends on a host of other things. Public statements, when the CEO or the head of strategy for the organization stands up and says, our strategy is, right, that may be consistent with the strategy, but the statement in and of itself is not a strategy. Financial or growth objectives, goals. Goals are very important, but they're not strategy. Return on equity, earnings per share, going public, which people may not think about as much these days, are important goals, but they're not strategy in and of themselves. They're the result of strategy. Market share, despite the sort of legendary status of Jack Welch and GE, we're going to be number one or number two in every market. That's a goal, but that's not a strategy. That is a result of effective strategy.